Good afternoon and happy Friday to Australia. Good morning to Europe, especially. Thank you very much for those that have joined live. And it is a pleasure to have Samir Sharma joining us all the way from the UK, from CEO of datazuum. Samir, good morning. Thank you so much for being here
Morning.
with us today.
Pleasure. Good afternoon.
Yes, good evening for us. It's Friday, so we are
Yes,
ready to um,
you're ready to party
enjoy
for
our
the
weekend.
weekend.
Exactly. You are with coffee, and I'm just waiting for my wine.
I, I'm actually with my water. I haven't had a chance to make coffee. I'm lagging a bit.
Okay, well, let's get that energy up. And yeah, so please, everyone who is watching, feel free to make any comments. I will be displaying them as soon as I see them coming. And yes, so well, we are here today. Let me see if anyone is commenting. No comments right now. Okay. Okay, so let's see when the comments come up. And okay, well, today we want to talk about something that is creating a lot of noise out there, but before we just dive in, I'd love to just get a little bit of your background. Samir, I know you have built your career. You have more than 20 years of experience working with the with people and organizations in this data and change. So what has that journey been from you in that space?
Laura, thank you for having me today, and it's really nice to be on the show. So I started out as a programmer, which many people don't know. And I was a COBOL programmer, which is really, now if you ask, is anybody a co-programmer, they'll say, oh, what's that? Unless they really know. But back in the day, that's how I started. And fundamentally, I did that for 3 years. It was an interesting time for me because one, I got to understand computers, and I got to understand how computers work, and I got to understand how products, and I got to understand how code works, and how it's, how you can create stuff and then ship that out and help somebody use it. But actually, what I found was that sitting in the back end and not seeing what happens to your code and your application that you built, and how users are using it, and how it's impacting them, and how it's helping them in their everyday lives, processes, is something that I started to get curious about. Sitting, what I would call in the bunker, coding all the time. So journey has taken me from that to understand the front end, the human end of human computer interaction, application interaction, change, behavioral change, mindset. And I've stayed within, obviously, I've worked across a number of different industries. So I started on the whole world of and then I fell into it in 2002. And that was really when I realized that all of the work that I'd done, ERP world, in programming, in actually getting out in front of the laptop or computer and actually speaking to people, working out what they wanted it. What was the purpose of what we were building? How was it helping the business drive and thrive? So my journey's really been one from a technical into a business world. And so that's helped me really understand a really good grounding in technology, but now understanding how that manifests itself in the world of business, and how any work that we do as technicians or data people, or technologists, etc., how does that actually impact the people that are using those tools, and how is it impacting the way that they operate in their daily work life? So that's kind of where I came upon the world of colliding business, technology, data, and change all together.
Wow, that's incredible. And do you have a moment when you realized that AI was coming? Because AI is kind of not new; it's been there for a while now, and people didn't know what it was, or it was very slow development. In what moment did you get like the realization that AI was here, not like a, like not just like a takeaway, but that it was gonna transform
Yeah.
how we live and work?
Mm. So look, I think there's a couple of things that I need to, sort of go back to. You said AI has been here for a long time, and AI has been around since the 50s. And the term was coined, in I think it was 56. Very early on in my career, when I fell into data, it was in 2002. Now, at that time, it was still very early days for a lot of the data world. The tools were not there. The tools were very clunky, and it's not like the abundance of tools we have now. And the migration from data analytics and AI has been that sort of steady migration. So I would say falling into data in about 2002, where I was asked to make money from data. Now that sounds a bit strange, make money from data, but it was how could we? The question was, how can we use our data to create a new revenue stream? Now that's an interesting proposition when you don't have tools, have expensive tools, blackened screens, which people won't remember who are probably watching this, and you're trying to extract data from very, what we call legacy systems now. So again, having to go back and reach into my programming days and having to access and pull data that was in these legacy systems, these AS400 systems. And again, it was COBOL based. So AI was fundamentally around, but it wasn't around in the way that we thought we would be using it back in 2002. It was very early days. Zip into, say, 2010. I know that people were using AI before, but AI was really what we term AI today. Most people only know AI from 2022 when ChatGPT was launched, right? That's the misconception, that everybody thinks AI only started then, but actually it started years ago. And in 2010, I realized that moving from the types of analytics that we were rolling out, we were doing a lot of work which was building and creating dashboards, providing those dashboards to users. But at some point, you start to say, well, that's not enough. So how do we start to then think about predictive modeling? How do we start to think about understanding where we can get a little bit more foresight? So then it was, customers would start coming to I was still working in corporate at the time, and I was working for a large American company. And customers were saying, well, actually, we'd like to do some predictions now. So that was at the cusp of when I really, of course, there are many people who are doing AI, but really machine learning as such, back in the early days. But that was the time where I thought, now we've started to get better tooling. Now we started to build a little bit more of better data structures, data models, and so on. And big data was around at that time as well. And you could start to drive more intense workloads, and therefore you could start to that kind of predictive modeling, which would lend to, maybe it was a fraud model that you spun up. Maybe it was predicting when customers would buy a particular product, or what products they might buy. You might be predicting, customers defaulting on their loans or their mortgages. So that was when I realized that we had moved from, the dashboard type what I term as very static capability to a very nuanced, forward-looking understanding, that sort of predictability around or a ballistic approach of how you could move data, very static point, into a very machine learning type driven. But the thing was, even though we were building those models, let's just build those models for the sake of it, it was actually tying it back to business outcomes and purpose and value. Really key for us. So that, AI was always around. So everybody who's using AI now is only the sort of memory is only from the Gen AI world. But lots of us who have been in, data analytics and AI for, over 25 years, we were doing it a long time ago. And therefore, that machine learning capability or computer vision or neural networks, they had been around for quite a while. Okay, neural nets were around a little bit longer. Computer vision came out, a little bit later, and models were being built around video and so on. But I think it's, those things were there. People were using it. And it's only now that people really start to think about AI in a different way, because day activity for people. Back then it was machine learning. People would say, what's that? But now when you say AI, they go, yeah, I've got my Gemini or my ChatGPT or Claude, and I ask it all the time. So I think the epiphany for me was much earlier, that we could build models to actually predict stuff, whether that's product-based, customer-based, fraudulent, whatever that might be, risk-based, but we needed it for a purpose, and the value needed to be linked to it. And therefore, we needed to understand why we're building it and what the outcomes were.
And that is actually a perfect segue, because this is one of the biggest challenges that we have, that we see from data, even from Gartner, from McKinsey, from all these companies that do a lot of research. That one of the biggest challenges is realizing the value of AI and the adoption, and like that challenge that now has transformed our businesses. And how do we actually, what steps do we take? And I'm gonna then now want to talk a little bit about precisely your book that you wrote. So thank you very much for this, because definitely is like a lot of experience that you are putting on this the feedback, the recommendations, it's incredible. But basically what you are actually exposing us, or letting us learn, is precisely how do we close that gap, because that's the challenge that we have. And we have always been implementing tools, trying to put tech, transforming organizations since we were rolling out ERPs, to come to the point of, okay, now what? And as you said, like now that at a user level, not only as leader or an owner or stakeholders or the board want to see what's the return on investment on AI. Now it's not about only data, not about the data analytics and the empowerment that decisions have, but so when you talk about closing the strategy gap in your experience, why do you think that the strategy like looks brilliant in paper, but it's so hard to make it a reality?
It's interesting. When I came out of the whole technology mold, when I came out of programming, basically, I asked my boss at the time, I'd like to transition into a very business facing role. I'd really like to understand how businesses work, how they operate, why in that way, how they make money. I was curious, and I started to get into the world of strategy as well. And it made me realize that when you're a technologist, you see stuff very much through that systemic view. It's always system. It's always about it's always about shipping something. It's always about, making sure you've done your testing and you've done your user testing, everything works and the bits work together and it's ready to go out. The challenge that I always saw is that, so what? It was okay, now we've got that. So what? And I would see so when I flipped and I would walk in, the business into what we always term as the business, the functions, the departments. And I would say, I worked on that system. How are you using it? And people would say, well, are we using it? Do we really care? We've got our side processes. We've got the things that we do, which we've done all the time. And it made me realize that when you're sitting in the background somewhere, you're not actually sitting with the user and understanding their processes, their workflows, their mindset making. And that was when I realized that you can sit down, you can create the most beautiful strategy in the world. And when it comes to implementing that strategy, people were not getting it right. So I in 2014 created datazuum. And the reason I created datazuum, and before that I was in corporate, and one of the things that I would always see is the corporate machine was very much around, we've got this, let's buy some technology, get the strategy from some, big company, let them create this, wonderful and most beautiful slide deck, and we've got the technology, so now let's deliver. No one can translate the strategy into an execution plan, and everybody just focused therefore on the technology, because they couldn't take what was in that strategy deck and say, yeah, I know exactly what to do. It was nice pictures, it was very glossy, it was really beautiful. And for me at that time, I was thinking strategy is not really about giving somebody a roadmap. Strategy is about choices. Strategy is about understanding what you shouldn't do more so than what you should. And so coming with that and, moving into that whole world of strategy and then moving from business strategy into data strategy, I realized that actually data strategy is less about data, more about business, more about understanding where value is driven, and then being able to get data analytics and now AI as an enabler to those types of and processes. And so I then realized that, one of the lessons I learned, and I've made these mix as well in the early days, and it was beautiful, Laura. It was the most amazing strategy that I'd ever written. How wonderful it was, right? And my own, because I came from a management consultancy background as well, and my own bias was built into strategy, because it had to be it had to have a maturity assessment. It had to score. It then had to have a set of capabilities. It had to have the nice technology landscape and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, and I made the same mistake, that this was not how you build strategy. And so I then, when I started datazuum, I said, if I'm going to deliver strategy, the first thing I need to do is forget about the data and forget about the technology. And at that time in 2014, that was a very new concept for people. People didn't really understand why I was doing that. And so when I'd say, right, so you would like a data strategy. Well, what I need to understand first is your business strategy or your corporate strategy. And I would like to understand what the levers are in there of how you're going to make, save, or protect your cash flow, your money, your revenues, and so on. So, and it was a very odd conversation that I'd have with people, because they'd say, why do you want to know that? We just want this new technology. And so it made me realize that people were still thinking in the whole world of technology, and they still do. And so I think what I learned was that most organizations will create strategies that have no link to how they will be actually implemented. And that was over the course of me delivering strategies, and my first client was a very large client. I built a strategy for them, and the strategy was based on the operational, because I sat with their and I had their commercial teams. I didn't want to know anything about data that was happening. I sat with those teams because I wanted to understand how to drive this stuff out. How are we going to create this value? How are we going to drive the business in terms of, again, that protection or the revenue generation or the cost efficiencies? And so at that time, I remember sitting, and I talk about it in the book. I remember into a meeting. It was the first day at this new client, and I walked in, and on one side, it was the commercial and the operational executives. And on the other side, it was the technology, data, and analytics executives. And there was a chap standing at the back of the room presenting what looked like which looked like all really small, massive. It was a massive wall, and they were projecting it onto this, the white wall in the background. And I had to squint to see what it was. And he was a data architect speaking to operational executives and commercial executives about a physical data model. In the minutiae of how tables, the relationships, what these entities were. And to me, I just thought, and you could see in the room, those business functions were sitting there and their blood was boiling because they didn't understand what he was talking about. And so all I heard from them was, we don't care about this. We just want the data. Give us the data. We'll do what we want with it, because we don't understand what you're doing. We don't understand this. You're talking in a different language. You don't understand what we need in terms of drivers. So at that moment, I said to everybody in the room, this meeting isn't going anywhere. And it was my first day at the clients. And they all looked at me and thought, who the hell is this guy? And I said, look, I'm here to build this strategy out, and I don't think this is the right way that we should be doing it. So I basically said, let's disband the meeting. We'll come back tomorrow. And I thought to myself, what have I done? I don't have a clue of what I'm going to be talking tomorrow about. So I booked into a room, had floor-to-ceiling whiteboards, and then I realized that the problem was we were talking about tech first, and I went back to we need to be business first. We need to be business led. So I built out a framework back in 2014, which eventually, after 27 iterations, became the canvas that I in the book. And I walked back into that room the next day with a very draft kind of canvas, very raw, but based on what I call a decision map. And it was, tell me what business questions are being answered. Tell me what processes are being understood within those decisions and within those questions. And then tell me what kind of data we need to answer those questions and drive those decisions, and where what is underpinning those processes. When I went back and spoke to them in that way, the commercial and operational teams were like, oh yeah, this makes sense to us now because you're speaking our language. And then I started to say, well, if we're going to build products, and if we're going to build you a dashboard that's going to provide you with near real-time incoming, but they were a logistics company, in parcels, and you want to track those, you want to see the volume incoming to your mail centers, and you then want to understand on a 8-minute basis how much volume coming in, how many people do we need to have on the floor, how many vans do we need, in order to do our deliveries, what's the workforce planning behind it. I started to realize that I could build based on those decisions that people wanted to make. And those products, however raw looking they might be, they didn't need to be slick. They needed to have the visual cues that people would take, because they knew that if I get this kind of data and I get this data point, I'm making this decision, and then I need to do it to take that action. That was the way that their brains worked. So I built products around the way that their processes, the business questions, and the decisions they needed to make. So that layering helped them to actually understand where they were driving their business from a commercial sense, but using data and analytics as an enabler. So I've talked a lot about that, but that was where the canvas came from. That was where the day one of this client thinking, we've got to do this in a different way, because we'll come back to the same old problem of delivering technology, people not using it, spending massive amounts of money, and for no value, no return, no outcomes delivered. Basically, where I realized that it's less about data, it's less about technology, it's more about decisions, and then it's more about the change in mindset and how people start to actually create different behaviors from that. So I'll stop there.
Wow. And actually, I was going to ask you if the companies, based on not only that company, but many others that you have worked with, is it a data problem or a decision making problem, a decision making lag? And you just answer the question. So it's not a data problem. It is actually, a decision that is going to allow
Yes.
them to, like enabler, and using this tech as enablers, not as
Correct.
the solution, right? To be successful, implemented change and mindset and all this that comes with that. So, with that in mind, what advice can you give to our leaders right now, or that will catch on the replay? What can they do about it? Because you say you are attached to the strategy when you are too deep in. You are blind to what probably opportunities are, or you are so committed to it that it's very hard to step away from it. What advice can you give them to support those decisions and take action
Yeah.
and make an impact with the people that is going to actually need to change that mindset and that to embrace the strategy?
So cheekily, buy my book because it's got it all in there. No, but I think, look, one of the what I've seen throughout my career is many people struggling to really deliver something of impact and credibility. And I would say, if you're going to think about building a data platform, or building, or buying a data platform, or building it, or whatever it might be, you've got to come back to the basics. You've got to really think about what are the outcomes that we're trying to deliver here, and those outcomes are not going to be in a technology. Those outcomes are. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was with a client, and they're delivering a data platform. They've got an external vendor in delivering a data platform, and I'm their entire operating model. And I sat down with the COO, and I said, "Look, you're building a data platform, right? You're building dashboards, and I've gone into and I've spoken to a lot of people in the business. Are they finding dashboards really usable and finding them valuable? Not so much. And I've got some recorded opinions from these people. Why is they're not finding them of use? He asked me. And I said, well, when I had a look at them, I realized that they've, from a technology perspective, they've been built because the technology is cool and I can get whatever I want and I can build a really nice design. I've got widgets on this and I've got nice, sliders and I've got beautiful, etc., etc. But actually, what the client wants, what the user wants, is a really set of cues, visual cues that will tell them. And what I then realized is that most of those dashboards are built on, would you like a metric on this dashboard? Yes. How big would you like the box? Oh, I'd like it this big. Would you like it to be in red because it's bad? Yeah, sure, it'll be great. But this doesn't really tell me, by the time I found out. So I think the problem is that we build these things in isolation still, sad to say, sad to see. We build them without understanding, and again, I'll go back to it. How does it link back to the strategy? And the reason I was having the conversation with the COO, because I said, look, I'm building this I'm building your operating model. But actually, what I really need is, if I'm going to link everything that we build from a data product perspective back to outcomes, I need to understand what's important for your business. So in the conversation, and I've got the points here. In the conversation, he said, oh, well, what do you mean, Samir? I said, well, I'd like to understand what really drives your business. Is it obviously profitability? That's one thing. Is it customer? Maybe that's another thing. Is it risk? Yes. And so I said, if I understand that, and every time somebody wants to create a data product or requests a data product, I want to know if the elements that they're asking for in that product back to one of these 4 or 5 strategic objectives. So he said, this is what he said: profitability, because it's definitely on the CEO's, radar, of course. The finance process, numbers at the end of year or end of month reporting, getting them right, because that means we understand how our business is doing. Regulatory, because we are a heavily regulated industry and we will get fines if we don't do certain things right. Good. Solvency capital. Do we have enough payment recoveries? Do we have enough reinsurance recoveries? Are we basically having enough capital in our business to run our business? And the final one was customer. And so when you hear that, that's exactly what you want everything on. But when I go in and ask people, so you've built this product, how does it map back to what the CEO? No one can ever tell me. No one can pinpoint why they've done it. So I would say always some basis, always understand what those drivers are. Equally, get a very good understanding of how the CEO wants to grow or move business. So is it we want to grow revenue by X% by 2027, and we want to grow it in these regions? We want to, reduce churn of our customers by X% by, 2027. At the moment, we know the baseline is X. We want to take it from X down to Y, because we need to reduce that, because it's hitting our profitability, it's hitting our net promoter scores. And so you start to have very different conversations around why you're doing this stuff. If we as data teams did that, we understood the differs that we're pulling and pushing, we would be able to build better products and ship those things with these things with this understanding. And so I implore every data team out there, every executive, to think about strategic objective, get an objective as well. So that's bound by some kind of number and time factor. Understand the decisions that people are making, map them to the business questions, and in the canvas that I've created, and you'll see this when you go into there's a page which has got the full canvas laid out in the actual book. It's got very specific questions. So one question is, I need to get my glasses on for this because I can't. Getting old and I need glasses. I start with, what's the first thing you need to understand? Strategic objectives. Start with the why. What is the business actually trying to achieve? Do we know that? Do we understand that? Have we got an understanding from the CEO, from the corporate strategy? The next thing is that I don't want to go straight. So what normally happens is we jump to technology and then we jump back right at the end to actually understand what the business problems were. And number 2 is key decisions. Understand what decisions must be enabled and what are the key use cases that drive those outcomes that are coming from the strategic objectives. Map that then into where can AI or advanced analytics improve or accelerate our decisions. And measure it. Apply some kind of value measures, cost benefit, your ROI, and how do we track then and communicate value for what we want to do, what those opportunities are, and what are the success metrics. If we can just answer those questions before we touch a bit of technology, we are 80% of the way there. And then we can get into things like data requirements and what products we're going to build and who we're doing it for and whether we have the technology. And that I call strategic enablement. And then we can get into the strategic, which is the mindset, which is the operating model, which is the portfolio, which is the risk and ethics behind this stuff. And I ask very simple questions. If you can answer this, I'm working with a right now who is using the canvas to run their entire AI portfolio. And why are they doing that? Because for 2 years, they've built products, delivered stuff with no value whatsoever. And they've wasted a lot of money. So they've come back and they've asked me, how do we get back to a point of how can we get back to basic principles? And we've got all this stuff going on, but can you help us? And so using the canvas, asking those questions, building out a map for them, building out that portfolio. Now they've started to realize, oh my God, so we didn't answer all these questions up front. And if we had, we would have built lasting, impactful, insightful products. And we would have been driving that from a revenue perspective or a cost efficiency or risk mitigation and so on. And now they're beginning to do that 2 years later with a very large budget that they've already, dropped in. So go back to those principles, answer those very simple questions before you start using technology or you start thinking about building products, because those are the fundamental questions that you need to answer. And it's not difficult. If you answer those questions, you can see where your gaps are, you can close those gaps. And that's the bit which I talk about, which is the strategy execution gap. That's the piece where people really don't understand why are they not being able to deliver and implement, and why are people not using this stuff? Because they haven't answered these questions. And it's simple. If you can answer those things, you can get 80% of the way there. And the 20% then is the technology and the tweaking, because the technology stuff is easy these days. I don't think it's the hard stuff that you need to do, which is this bit. And if you can get this right, and I've sat, with the bank, and I'm doing it with insurance companies as well. And we have done in and out of working through the canvas, bringing their initial portfolio into it. We have initiatives that weren't working, that weren't producing money. We've elevated initiatives that nobody really thought about, that were actually going to drive value, because we did the hard work of attaching a value number to and saying, whoa, if we actually did this, it would be better than the other ones that we're trying to do. Why this one? Because no one thought it was sexy enough to do it. So, in the book, you can close that gap, and then you can start delivering better products, start delivering value, start delivering that value earlier, not 3, 4, 5 years down the line, 6 months, 3 to 6 months down the line. And that's where we want to get to as organizations. Because things are getting easier on the technology side, they're getting more difficult on actually understanding the drivers and the value piece.
Wow.
Help.
And that's yeah, and that's the recipe. That's the recipe that you are sharing with all of us in here. And I see you also have this the change and culture lens. And
Yes.
our audience
Yes.
mostly is leadership here. So you talk about leadership ambiguity, cultural misalignment, fear of obsolescence, and the communication breakdown. And this lack of capability building, misaligned metrics. Like, technology can be easy, there is plenty of it out there, you can go back to the basics,
Yes.
but that's not the whole piece of the puzzle, right? We need to talk on that
Yes.
the human impact. And this is where, like, personally, I'm so passionate about. It's like having the strategy so beautiful and you cannot implement or execute. You can have the tech, you can have the strategy, you can have the leaders on board, but what happens with the human side of change? Like, what's the
Yeah.
fear in the workforce? And if you can just talk about a little bit of what happens, of what people experience when they see this massive change in their work, right? And it's not about only the AI, but AI, data analytics. Like,
Oh,
I
it's
have
about
seen so
everything.
many people,
Yeah.
yeah, vulnerability. They are fear because, oh, now there is no way to hide. The data is there, is showing that I could have been performing better. Is it more about that, or is it more about, um okay, I don't know what's going to happen to my role or to my future because they probably don't need me anymore? So what is that? What does that mean, and how do leaders
You know,
manage those conversations with their teams?
yeah. So I've always baked change, and I've attempted to understand culture in organizations for those very real factors that you talk about. Way back in my early days of corporate and moving from that programming mentality out into the business functions, I realized that people change every day. Actually, as human beings, we go through an immense amount of change, whether it's in our business lives or it's in our personal lives. The challenge that I've seen from where people talk about this is, in the data world, unfortunately, we've taken data, we've said that people don't understand data, and therefore they are illiterate. And we are telling people out there in business functions that you need to be data literate. And what does this mean, business person? It means that I have to now learn a whole new terms and new buzzwords, and I need to understand what and data literacy was always, in my opinion, a technology driven thing, because it was always about, oh, we're going to train people on dashboards, we're going to train them on SQL, we're going to do this stuff with business people. It's insane. I don't get it. The challenge that we have is that when people build an analytics and AI programs and whatever, change is the component that the last thing that's thought about. Because I think change is a training program. They don't realize that actually change is an observable, it's an observable factor of how people actually change their processes and their mindsets and their behaviors day to day. And we do the time, Laura. What I think is really something that I see when I go speak to CEOs, because I'm often seen as the data strategy person or the data and AI strategy person or whatever you want to call it, is I will walk in and I'll say, okay, I know you want a strategy, that's why you've called me in. I get that. But actually, what's the culture of your organization? How do people take on change in this organization? Show me programs of change that have worked. And I can tell you clearly, 85 to 90% of the time, they cannot show me anything that has worked well. And you can see stats from organizations like Gartner and IDC and MIT and all those wonderful organizations come up with their why do data programs fail? Why do AI programs fail? Why do ERP programs fail? Why RM programs fail? Because it's all down to people. It's all down to how we understand what's happening I don't think we take enough time to actually understand and really work with end users to get into their daily lives, their patterns. If I am building something, why am I not going to sit right next to the user and observe what they do before I build something? Observe how they use one system against another system, how they take a bit of information from there to make a decision here, how they workflow it through their processes. If we can get that, we will then be able to create products that they will use, and we won't even have to think about change. We won't even have to think explicitly about, have we got a change program in place and have we now trained the users on this new system, and that's the change, that's the level of change that we need to go through. It's not about that. It's not about the end and training people. It's about taking people from day one. And that's why when I speak to a CEO and I say to them, what about culture? Look at me and say, why are you asking me those questions? You're the data strategy guy. Just do strategy. And I say, because if you fundamentally want me to do this, then I need to understand your business, the rights and in your business that have been in there for years. I need to understand how people speak at the water. Understand the data, the granularity, the muscle factor, the blood that goes through your organization, because all of that is how we will onboard new stuff into your organization. And so they're kind of like, oh, I've never understood that. And that's why also I see that many organizations struggle with operating models, because they've never taken the time to break down the cultural aspect of the business. So in the work that I do on an operating model perspective, the first thing I look at is culture. How is the culture being set? How are the values being driven? How are people accepting that? How are they using it in their day-to-day work? Where are we getting pockets of resistance and why? And resistance is a great word that people use, because data and tech teams for many always use, oh, we did it, but our users are resistant to it. Of course they're resistant, because you didn't factor in tons of things that they, so step back. That's why an important factor in the book is consumers and users. It's point 6. It's midway point, because it's a check-in point to say, are we building this stuff for the people that need it and for the way they behave now? And are we going to move them from that behavior pattern into something new? And if we move them from that, we need to understand need from a work perspective in order for us to move them into that. So we ask those questions right in the middle before we start building stuff. We get it right. Are we building this with their workflows and processes in mind? Are we building it, for the way we see the world? And it's really not, it's really not just about doing the dashboard because the users told me they want it figured like this. It's actually going back and asking them those difficult questions. Because if you can ask them those difficult questions, you will have a breakthrough in terms of, now I see why I'm going to build this, and I'm going to see how it infuses into the way that they work in their processes. Ask that question, then you're going to build something that's going to be used, and someone's going to come up and say, oh, why did we not use this? Because then the users will say, well, it wasn't built for these reasons. So bake it in at the beginning. Understand the psychology behind the build these products, how people work, how fundamentally they make decisions. And that's why working from a decision perspective is the only way that we can understand and build better products. And I will always stand behind that. And it will always lead us to the cultural angle. It will always lead us to why change doesn't work and what we need to enable that change to be. So having the conversations up front is the only way that I do it. It's the only way that we do it well. Right now, doing a model with an insurance company, if I'm not talking to the COO, the CEO, and the IT people, and some of the business function, if I'm not getting them in the room and saying, I am building an operating model, it is going to be based on your culture, your values, the way that you engage people, the engagement frameworks that we're going to have, the new ways of working. That's all cultural based. That's all mindset based. If I don't get that right, implementing stuff will not work. And so taking them through that journey is the way that we need to do it. And that's how the way I caveat it is, the operating model is the way you make the strategy real. That's the way I see the operating model. And that's why you need to take that beautiful strategy deck, translate it into a very different view of the world, which is choices and what you want to deliver and what you don't want to deliver, and drive that into your operating model. Understand from a cultural and change perspective and an organizational perspective how you need to modify, how you need to work, how you need to build the structures for the future, how you need to have these amoeba-like structures that can help you to rebuild and continuously adapt organizations for this new world. And if you're stuck in the static world of this is how we do stuff, we've always done it that way, it's never going to work.
Fantastic. Wow. I honestly, I'm so pumped up. I want to go and look at my strategy and say, okay, what's my business goal here? Is this what I'm doing is going to give me the value and the return on investment? Because I mean, I do have some that I work on and I just go, I don't think that fits anywhere. So you just made me think of all that.
Because immediately
wow.
when it's not right.
Yeah, wow, that's been fantastic, and I can believe it's almost time to wrap up. Samir, this has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you for
Thank
letting
you.
us learn from you through your experience, through the work that you do, and as you said, not to be like a commercial, but we just love sharing. And so for whoever that is listening, please, that's the QR code. That's the Amazon. You can get in Amazon the strategy canvas. And you said for any strategy you're working on, AI or no AI is gonna work. And
Yes, correct. Yeah.
yes, and thank you very much, Samir, for this, because like really, really, you have given us a lot to process, a lot to think, a lot to consider, and what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to just plan a little bit of posts and some snippets to keep people learning and listening to this, because it's so valuable. Every part of the conversation have is so good. Thank you. Really, really, I have no words
Well,
to
thank
thank
you
you,
so
and to
much.
all our listeners and our subscribers from Australia Artificial Intelligence. That we a lot of people following from around the world. We have people from the US, from America, Europe, here in Australia, New
Great.
Zealand. So to all of you, please really, really listen to this. Get the book. It's gonna be like it's a masterpiece that you need to get. And I really, really, really want to thank you and wishing you everyone the best. And again, thank you, Samir, for joining us and for sharing all this knowledge that you pack for us. Very simple. And thank you for the guide. It's really gonna help a lot of leaders here and a lot of organizations, which is really the impact we want to make, right? To make more organizations
Absolutely.
profitable and happy and everything. So, well, thank you very, very much for this, and
Thank you.
I thank you very much, and I'll see you everyone else, and look at the replay and keep you posting and inviting you to the next event. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye
Bye. Thank
bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.